from that vehicle?
It's my call not on responding grocery inspector. Provide the description. I literally just walk out of this. I'll get you my receipt.
Don't reach for anything. Then how am I supposed to show you a receipt? You're being uncooperative. I might need backup. Backup for what? For a federal prosecution?
The camera is already recording when the patrol car stops. A grocery store parking lot. Early evening, plastic bags hang from a man's hands, stretching thin with weight. Nothing is hidden. Nothing is hurried. According to the footage, the officer steps out and issues a command without explaining why. The man freezes, then complies. From the first second, this encounter carries a problem it never corrects. To the officer, this appears routine. A black man outside a grocery store. A vague concern. A moment to assert control. But the frame contains an irony that does not announce itself. The person being detained has spent years on the opposite side of scenes like this, not as a defendant, but as someone tasked with enforcing constitutional limits on government power. None of that is visible here. The groceries remain in his hands. Authority fills the silence. According to the footage, the officer asks for identification. The man provides it immediately. Calm. Precise. This is the first decision point. Verification could have ended the encounter. It doesn't. The officer continues questioning without stating a basis. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. What the camera cannot show, but court records later would, is the weight of the authority now being tested. This man has previously acted in cases where unlawful detention mattered. He has reviewed police conduct against Fourth Amendment standards. He has signed federal filings evaluating whether officers articulated reasonable suspicion or crossed constitutional lines. Those actions exist in the public record. They are not asserted here. They collide silently with what is unfolding. The officer studies the identification. No crime is alleged. No suspicious behavior is described. According to the footage, the man remains compliant, his posture open, his movements deliberate. Another decision point passes. The officer could disengage. He doesn't. The groceries are set down. Time stretches. Each additional second without explanation narrows the officer's legal footing. The man asks no provocative questions. He does not raise his voice. He waits for the process to work. It doesn't. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. Later, the outcome of this encounter would be reduced to a number. Not an estimate, not a projection, a jury verdict. $3.8 million. That figure does not appear on screen now, but it hangs over the scene like gravity. It is the cost of decisions made in small increments, none of which seem decisive in the moment. The camera keeps recording. The officer maintains control. The man remains where he is told to stand. What neither of them acknowledges is that the legal narrative is already forming. The absence of articulated cause, the continuation without justification, the escalation without foundation. This is not a story about intent. It is a story about record, about what is said on camera and what is not. Everything that follows investigation, litigation, judgment will flow from these first minutes, captured without commentary, without interpretation. The legitimacy of this encounter rests on a single question: whether there was any lawful basis to detain him at all. According to the footage, the man is standing beside his vehicle, grocery bags in hand, engaged in an ordinary activity in a public place where he has every right to be. There is no allegation announced on camera, no description of a reported crime, no explanation of why his presence requires intervention. That absence is not incidental. In constitutional terms, it is foundational. The officer's first justification appears only implicitly. He asks questions without stating cause, positioning the interaction as investigatory rather than consensual. This is another decision point. Under the Fourth Amendment, a consensual encounter allows a citizen to walk away. A detention does not. The officer's posture, tone, and commands signal that walking away is not an option. According to footage, the man remains where he is told to stand. The threshold has been crossed. The man complies. He answers questions. He hands over identification when requested. Each of these actions reinforces his legitimacy, not the officer's suspicion. There is no refusal, no evasion, no conduct that would elevate the encounter into reasonable suspicion of a crime. Court documents later emphasize this sequence because compliance does not create suspicion. It removes it. The officer studies the identification. This is a critical moment. Verification is the mechanism designed to end mistaken stops. It is the institutional off-ramp. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. Instead, the questioning continues. The officer asks where he is coming from, where he is going, why he is there. According to the footage, the answers are ordinary. They align with the groceries, the location, the time of day. Nothing conflicts. At this point, the legitimacy gap becomes visible. On one side is the officer's perception, an unarticulated suspicion that persists without factual support. On the other is the reality documented on camera, a law-abiding citizen engaged in routine conduct, fully cooperative, presenting valid identification. The gap widens with each additional minute the detention continues. The man does not assert his profession. He does not challenge the officer's authority verbally. He does not escalate. This restraint is not accidental. Court filings later noted that he understood how assertions of status can provoke rather than resolve encounters. He relies instead on process, assuming that adherence to procedure will correct the situation. That assumption proves incorrect. Another decision point arrives when the officer requests additional information beyond identification. There is no indication on camera that new facts have emerged to justify expanding the scope of the detention. The groceries remain untouched. The vehicle remains parked. No search is conducted, but the continued questioning itself extends the seizure. This extension matters legally. A detention justified at its inception can become unlawful if prolonged without cause. According to official filings later reviewed by the court, this extension formed a central issue. The officer had the information necessary to disengage. He chose not to. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. The man's behavior continues to reinforce his legitimacy. His tone remains even. His movements are slow and visible. He asks clarifying questions, not confrontational ones. He seeks to understand why he is being held. The officer does not provide an answer. Silence fills the space where justification should be. In constitutional analysis, silence can be as consequential as action. The absence of a stated reason deprives the detained person of the ability to respond meaningfully. It also deprives later reviewers of contemporaneous justification. Investigators and jurors do not infer reasons retroactively. They look for them where they should have appeared. On the footage, they do not. Another decision point passes when the officer confers briefly, off camera, before returning to continue the detention. No new explanation follows. The legitimacy gap is now structural. The longer the encounter continues without cause, the harder it becomes to justify its continuation. This is how routine stops turn into constitutional violations, not through a single dramatic act, but through accumulated inaction. Throughout this period, the man remains within the bounds of the law. He does not attempt to leave. He does not obstruct. He does not refuse lawful commands. These details later become decisive. Court documents state that the case did not turn on disputed facts, but on undisputed ones captured on video. The man's compliance is not contested. The officer's lack of articulated suspicion is not supplemented elsewhere in the record. The legitimacy gap now has consequences. What began as a momentary inquiry has become a prolonged detention, unsupported by reasonable suspicion. Each additional question, each additional second, compounds the legal exposure. This is not apparent on the ground, but it is unavoidable in review. At no point does the officer acknowledge the possibility of error. At no point does he disengage. The process does not self-correct. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. By the time the encounter moves beyond the parking lot exchange, the legal posture is already compromised. The man's legitimacy is intact and well documented. The officer's justification is not. That imbalance will shape everything that follows, from internal review to courtroom analysis. The outcome will not depend on motive or intent, but on this simple record. Who had the right to be there? Who complied with the law? And who continued despite having no lawful reason to do so? What happened next cannot be understood by focusing on the officer alone. The footage captures individual decisions, but those decisions sit inside a larger institutional context, one that explains why the encounter does not correct itself once it begins to drift. According to later reviews, this was not a breakdown of training in the moment, but the predictable outcome of a system conditioned to maintain control once it asserts it. Police departments train officers to establish command early in encounters. The rationale is safety and clarity. But that same doctrine carries a secondary effect. Once authority is asserted, disengagement can be perceived internally as loss of control. The footage reflects this tension. The officer does not escalate physically, but he also does not retreat procedurally. Control is maintained by continuation. This is another decision point, though it does not announce itself as one. The officer has options: clarify the basis for detention, request supervisory input, or terminate the encounter. According to footage, none of those occur. Instead, the interaction remains suspended in an ambiguous state, neither progressing toward arrest nor resolving toward release. This limbo is not accidental. It is the product of institutional habit. Court documents later describe this pattern without assigning motive. Investigators did not conclude that the officer intended to violate rights. They concluded something narrower and more consequential: that the department's practices tolerated prolonged detentions without contemporaneous articulation of cause. In other words, the system allowed officers to keep going without forcing a legal checkpoint. This matters because constitutional compliance is not measured by outcome alone. It is measured by process. A department that does not require officers to articulate suspicion at the moment it forms creates an environment where suspicion can exist without scrutiny. According to official filings, that absence becomes visible only after footage is reviewed in slow motion, frame by frame, by people whose job is not control but assessment. The officer's continued questioning reflects another institutional reflex: double down rather than reverse. Once an encounter extends beyond its initial purpose, reversing course can feel like admitting error. The footage shows no verbal acknowledgement of uncertainty, no recalibration, just continuation. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. Supervisory structures are designed to intervene in precisely these moments. But supervisors are not present on scene. They appear later, through reports and reviews. According to departmental procedures later outlined in court, officers are often given wide discretion in the field, with accountability deferred until after the fact. That delay creates a window where unlawful conduct can fully mature before being recognized as such. The man at the center of the encounter remains unaware of this institutional backdrop. He experiences only the immediate effect: a prolonged detention without explanation. What he cannot see, but what the record will later reveal, is that each additional minute strengthens his position and weakens the department's. The system's inertia is working against itself. Another decision point arrives when the officer's questions circle back on themselves. The same inquiries are repeated without new information. This repetition is not investigatory. It is procedural stalling. According to later analysis, repetition without purpose was one of the indicators reviewers cited in concluding that the detention had lost any lawful justification. Still, the officer does not disengage. The culture of control persists. The department's tolerance for ambiguity fills the gap where constitutional clarity should be. This is how individual judgment and institutional practice intersect, not dramatically, but quietly. By the time the encounter begins to shift toward formal action, the legal damage is already embedded. The footage has captured not just what the officer did, but what the system permitted him not to do. That distinction will become central later when responsibility is assessed beyond the individual level. The camera keeps recording. The department's policies are invisible but present. The man remains compliant. The opportunity to correct course has passed multiple times without recognition. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. By the time the encounter moves beyond questioning, the escalation is no longer subtle. According to the footage, the officer issues firmer commands, narrowing the man's physical space and options. This is the moment where discretion gives way to compulsion. The detention is no longer implied. It is explicit. This is another decision point. The officer could articulate a specific, lawful basis for continuing. He does not. He could request a supervisor. He does not. He could disengage. He does not. Instead, he advances the encounter into a phase that carries measurable legal consequences. The man complies again. His hands remain visible. His voice stays level. According to footage, there is no attempt to flee, no resistance, no behavior that would independently justify escalation. The groceries are set aside. The scene shifts from inquiry to control. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. As the officer's commands intensify, the constitutional stakes change. Under established Fourth Amendment standards, The scope and duration of a detention must be reasonably related to its initial justification. Here, the initial justification was never stated. Expansion without foundation compounds the violation. Court documents later focused on this sequence, not because it was dramatic, but because it was methodical. Another decision point occurs when the officer positions the man in a way consistent with arrest procedures, despite the absence of a stated offense. According to footage, this transition is not accompanied by explanation. Silence fills the gap where probable cause should be articulated. This silence will matter later, when reviewers search the record for contemporaneous justification and find none. The man asks why this is happening. His question is calm, procedural. He is not arguing facts. He is requesting process. The officer does not answer. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. At this stage, escalation is no longer about suspicion. It is about momentum. Each step forward creates sunk costs, time invested, authority asserted, control maintained. Reversal would require acknowledgement that earlier steps were unwarranted. According to later filings, this psychological and institutional pressure is common, but it does not excuse constitutional deviation. The officer proceeds. Commands are repeated. The man follows them. The interaction now bears the outward appearance of lawful enforcement, even as its foundation remains absent. This appearance is deceptive. It will not survive review. Another decision point arises when additional officers enter the frame. Reinforcement can stabilize encounters or accelerate them. Here, according to footage, it accelerates. The presence of backup reinforces the initial officer's course rather than questioning it. No one pauses to reassess the basis for detention. The opportunity for peer correction passes unnoticed. From a legal perspective, this is critical. Each officer who participates inherits the same obligation to ensure that the detention is lawful. Court documents later state that collective action does not dilute individual responsibility. The failure to reassess becomes shared. The man's compliance continues. He does not invoke his profession. He does not threaten legal action. He does not resist. This restraint will later be interpreted not as acquiescence, but as evidence. It demonstrates that escalation was not driven by the subject's behavior. It was driven by the officer's decisions. Another decision point occurs when the encounter transitions into formal custody. According to footage, this transition happens without new facts emerging. No contraband is discovered. No witness appears. No crime is articulated. The only change is procedural posture. This is the clearest point at which the encounter could have ended without further consequence. It does not. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. Once formal custody begins, the legal exposure expands dramatically. Detention becomes arrest. Temporary seizure becomes deprivation of liberty. Each step triggers additional constitutional protections. Each protection is now at risk of being violated because the underlying justification remains absent. The man remains composed. His posture does not change, but the power dynamic has. Authority is now fully asserted. Ironically, this is where the unseen authority reversal begins to take shape. The man being restrained has, in other contexts, evaluated arrests like this one. He has reviewed files where officers failed to articulate cause and watched cases unravel because of it. That experience does not surface as argument here. It exists as background force, colliding silently with the present. According to later court analysis, this collision is central. The case does not hinge on whether the officer believed he was acting appropriately. It hinges on whether the actions, as recorded, meet constitutional standards. Belief does not substitute for articulation. Authority does not substitute for cause. Another decision point passes when the officers complete the arrest process without revisiting the original basis for the stop. There is no retroactive clarification, no supplemental explanation. The record remains exactly what the camera captured. Commands issued, compliance given, escalation executed without stated justification. By the time the scene concludes, the legal narrative is already fixed. The footage will not change. The absence of articulated suspicion will not be filled later. The escalation ladder has been climbed rung by rung, each step narrowing the possibility of lawful defense. This was not one mistake. It was a sequence. What remains unseen at the scene but inevitable in review is that the authority asserted here will soon be examined by people trained to measure it against constitutional limits. Judges, attorneys, and jurors will not evaluate tone or intent. They will evaluate decisions. And those decisions, recorded in real time, will speak for themselves. The camera stops recording, the encounter ends, the consequences have already begun. The review begins where the encounter ended, with the footage. According to official records later introduced in court, the video becomes the primary document, not testimony, not recollection. The camera establishes the timeline with precision that memory cannot match. Every command, every pause, every unanswered question is preserved exactly as it occurred. The first stage of review is internal. A supervisor watches the footage not to interpret motive, but to assess compliance. This is another decision point, though it happens off the street. The question is narrow. Was there an articulated basis for the detention at each stage? According to internal notes later summarized in filings, that articulation is missing. The absence is not filled by later explanation. Supervisors are trained to look for justification where it should appear, not where it can be reconstructed after the fact. From supervision, the review moves to internal affairs. This transition matters. Internal affairs does not evaluate outcomes. It evaluates exposure. According to investigators later confirmed in official filings, the focus shifts to whether the department can defend the encounter if challenged. The footage is replayed, slowed, annotated. Each decision point is isolated. Each missed opportunity to disengage is logged. This was another chance to stop. It didn't happen then, and it cannot happen now. The investigators note the same pattern the footage shows: prolonged detention without stated cause, escalation without new facts, arrest without articulated offense. None of these elements are disputed. The case does not hinge on credibility conflicts. It hinges on what the camera shows and what it does not. Silence, in this context, is evidentiary. At this stage, the department's legal counsel becomes involved. According to court documents, the city attorney's office reviews the file with a different mandate: risk assessment. The question is no longer whether policy was followed, but whether litigation is survivable. The answer depends on standards that are not subjective. Reasonable suspicion must be articulated. Probable cause must be present. Neither appears on the recording. This is another decision point. The city can attempt to defend the encounter aggressively, or it can acknowledge vulnerability and prepare for resolution. According to later filings, the footage constrains those options. Jurors respond to video differently than to testimony. They do not infer justifications that are not spoken. They do not assume facts that are not visible. As the case develops, external review replaces internal assessment. Formal claims are filed. Timelines are established. Discovery begins. According to court records, depositions do not introduce new facts that alter the core narrative. Officers describe their perceptions. Attorneys compare those descriptions to the footage. Where they diverge, the footage prevails. Another decision point occurs when experts are consulted. Use of force experts, constitutional scholars, and training specialists review the video independently. Their analyses, later summarized in filings, converge on the same conclusion: the detention exceeded constitutional bounds early and never recovered. The escalation ladder, once climbed, could not be justified retroactively. Throughout this process, the man at the center of the case does not need to testify to intent or emotion. His role is defined by the record. His compliance is visible. His restraint is documented. The legitimacy gap identified earlier becomes the central theme of the case. On one side, a citizen acting within the law. On the other, authority exercised without foundation. The evidence accumulates in layers. Footage leads to supervisory concern. Supervisory concern leads to internal affairs findings. Internal findings lead to legal exposure. Each layer reinforces the last. This is the payoff schedule beginning to take shape, not in dramatic revelation, but in procedural inevitability. At no point does new information emerge that rescues the initial decision to detain. There is no late discovered crime, no overlooked warrant disclosed on camera. According to official records, none exist. The case proceeds on the strength of what is already known. By the time the investigation phase concludes, the outcome is no longer uncertain. The only remaining questions are timing and magnitude. How long the city will resist resolution, How much the failure to stop will cost. Those answers will come next, quantified and formalized. The legal consequences begin to crystallize once the case enters the formal court system. According to court documents later made public, the lawsuit is framed narrowly and deliberately. It does not allege broad misconduct. It alleges specific constitutional violations supported by a single, continuous record, the footage. The claims focus on unlawful detention and arrest under the Fourth Amendment. The theory is straightforward. The plaintiff argues that the officer lacked reasonable suspicion to initiate and prolong the detention and lacked probable cause to effect an arrest. The city's exposure does not depend on disputed facts. It depends on whether the video, as viewed by an ordinary juror, supports the officer's decisions. This framing limits ambiguity. It also limits defensive options. During pretrial proceedings, the city evaluates its position. According to filings later summarized by the court, motions are considered and withdrawn. Summary judgment becomes difficult where video evidence exists. Courts do not defer to officer characterization when footage tells a different story. The standard is not what the officer believed, but what a reasonable officer could articulate at the time. The articulation is absent. This is another decision point for the city. Proceeding to trial carries risk, but settlement carries cost. According to the record, negotiations occur under the shadow of the footage. The plaintiff's legal team does not need to speculate about motive. They play the video, they pause it where commands are issued, they ask when suspicion is stated, the silence answers for them. As the case moves forward, depositions reinforce what the camera already shows. Officers describe their actions in procedural terms. Those descriptions are compared against timestamps. Where explanations rely on perceptions not voiced at the scene, the discrepancy becomes apparent. According to court transcripts, these gaps weaken the defense rather than strengthen it. The trial phase sharpens the exposure further. Jurors are instructed on constitutional standards before they see the footage. They are told what reasonable suspicion requires. They are told that detention must be justified at each stage. Then, they watch. According to post-verdict statements later entered into the record, jurors did not struggle with the facts. They struggled only with the length of the violation. This leads to the number. The verdict includes compensatory damages reflecting loss of liberty, reputational harm, and emotional distress, as recognized under federal civil rights law. It also includes an amount designed to account for the seriousness of the violation. The total reaches $3.8 million. The court does not characterize it as punitive rhetoric. It characterizes it as proportionate to the conduct proven. The verdict is not accompanied by dramatic language. Courts rarely are. Instead, the judgment is precise. It cites the footage. It cites the timeline. It cites the absence of articulated cause. The ruling does not speculate about intent. It does not label the officer's character. It measures actions against standards and finds them wanting. Following the verdict, the city faces additional decisions. Appeals are considered. According to official records, the video constrains appellate arguments. Appellate courts review legal error, not factual reweighing. Where the facts are fixed by video, the margin for reversal narrows. The city evaluates the cost of prolonging the case against the certainty of the judgment. The financial consequence extends beyond the verdict itself. Legal fees accrue, insurance considerations arise, budget adjustments are required. According to municipal disclosures later reviewed, the case becomes a line item, a quantified outcome of an encounter that began without stated cause. For the officer involved, administrative consequences are addressed separately. The verdict does not automatically determine employment outcomes unless specified in policy or settlement terms. According to official statements, those details are handled through internal processes not fully disclosed in public records. What is disclosed is the legal finding. The detention was unconstitutional. The significance of the $3.8 million figure lies not in its size alone, but in its derivation. It is the product of sequential review. Footage, investigation, litigation, judgment. Each stage affirms the last. No new narrative emerges to replace the original record. The camera remains the final authority. In legal analysis, this outcome is described as foreseeable. Once the footage exists and the standards are clear, the result follows. The verdict does not create new law. It enforces existing law against documented conduct. The system does not react emotionally. It reacts procedurally. By the time the judgment is entered, The question of what happened in the parking lot is no longer open. It has been answered repeatedly by supervisors, investigators, attorneys, and jurors, all working from the same record. The authority asserted on the ground has been measured against constitutional limits and found to exceed them. The consequence is fixed, measurable, and final. The aftermath unfolds quietly, not at the scene, but inside policy manuals, training rooms, and budget meetings. According to official statements later released by the city, the case prompts internal review beyond the individuals involved. The footage does not disappear after the verdict. It becomes instructional material. Departments do not announce systemic change with moral language. They document adjustments. Training curricula are revised to emphasize articulation at the moment of detention. Officers are reminded that authority without stated cause is not neutral. It is exposure. Supervisors are instructed to intervene earlier when encounters drift without justification. These measures are not described as reforms. They are described as risk mitigation. The case also alters how footage is treated internally. According to departmental guidance referenced after the judgment, video is no longer viewed primarily as a defensive asset. It is treated as an independent witness. Officers are trained to assume that silence will be evaluated, not excused. What is not said on camera will not be supplied later. This recalibration is procedural, not rhetorical. Oversight mechanisms adjust as well. Civilian review boards and legal departments incorporate the case into assessment frameworks. The lesson is narrow and repeatable. When a detention begins without articulated cause, it rarely recovers. Prolongation compounds error. Escalation magnifies liability. These conclusions are drawn without reference to intent or character. They are derived from outcome. For the city, the financial consequence remains on record. The $3.8 million verdict becomes part of annual disclosures. It is categorized alongside other settlements and judgments, each tied to a specific incident, each traceable to a sequence of decisions. Budget officers do not debate morality. They track frequency. They ask where intervention could have reduced cost. The answer, repeatedly, is earlier. The officer's career outcome is addressed through administrative channels. According to public records, departments rarely disclose personnel discipline in detail. What matters for the system is not the individual resolution, but the precedent set by the case. Future encounters are evaluated against it. Training references it indirectly. Legal counsel cites it internally when advising on exposure. For the man at the center of the case, the aftermath is similarly understated. The verdict does not restore lost time. It does not erase the encounter. It affirms, formally and publicly, that the detention should not have occurred. His role in the legal system enforcing constitutional boundaries intersects here with lived experience. The collision is resolved not by narrative, but by judgment. The lasting impact of the footage lies in its undeniability. Policies can be debated. Testimony can conflict. Video fixes events in place. According to later commentary by legal analysts, cases like this reshape institutional behavior not because they are dramatic, but because they are clear. The law does not change. Compliance does. There is no final speech, no declaration of values. The system absorbs the case as data. Training updates are logged. Procedures are amended. Budgets are adjusted. The camera did not argue. It recorded. The verdict did not persuade. It measured. What changed afterward is not sentiment, but structure.